Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Griscom stream. David with you here, broadcasting to you live from Austin, Texas. Hope you are well wherever you are. Looking forward to chatting. These are a little bit more relaxed streams, so I'll be looking at the chat, answering questions. I got a couple things I might want to get into today, but I'm sure that y'all have a lot of questions and really do appreciate those. For folks who are new, just know that I do these streams once a week, mainly on Tuesdays. Though last week I did Thursday, and then our main show is every Wednesday at 7 Central with me and Matt Leck. This week I'm really excited. We're going to be doing a deep dive into Entergy, which is a power company that has been wreaking havoc on the people of New Orleans and Louisiana. Talking about one of my favorite subjects, why we need public power. Along with that, we're hoping to be speaking later this week with Victor Puggi. You heard that right? We're going to be getting double down on Brazil. So last week we had Brian Meir on to talk about these huge Bolsonaro protests, pro-Bolsonaro protests in Brasilia. There's been a lot of development already. So we're going to be joined by, we're going to be joined by our man, Brian. Is everything coming through to y'all okay? I'm using a new system again. I'm hoping that this is working, but I want to make sure that you are able to hear me all right. I'm really looking forward to that as well. Okay, good. Thank you. You never know. It's one of those things, you're sitting in your room by yourself thinking you're talking to people. I'll never forget, Matt and I did a whole post game about like an hour and a half, just the two of us talking back and forth. We didn't record it. It wasn't going anywhere. So I'm always, sort of looking out for that. But anyways, we're going to be joined hopefully on Thursday, and we'll release it on Sunday by Victor Puggi to do a deep dive into basically what's happened already this week with those protests, but also to do a kind of more holistic view as to what's happening in Brazil, both politically but also economically. I'm really looking forward to that as well. So again, for people who just joined us this week, we got all of our... these are more casual, so feel free to jump in to the chat. We already got some in here, so let me get to them. In YouTube over here, we got Patrick Stevens. I really appreciate the chat here. Manchin wants a corporate tax rate increase to 25%. If it happens, will we see him in a tax the rich suit emblazoned on Briani? I don't think that Manchin is going to be celebrating too much any tax increases, if we're being completely honest. We got Robert Salazar from Dallas. Thank you so much. I do appreciate chat, and always love seeing our friends from Texas here. I mean, man, it's getting pretty amazing. For folks who aren't familiar, we're still waiting for somebody to run against Greg Abbott for governor, which is just amazing, and in my opinion, just exposes the complete failure that we're seeing from the Democratic Party across the country, but specifically here in Texas, to be able to recruit and cultivate any kind of talent. The reason that, people will tell you the reason why nobody's running for governor is because nobody wants to, expose themselves and their family and all that kind of stuff that goes with running, and then lose, which I can understand on a personal level, but on a systemic level, that's unbelievable. That the opposition party here is not able to even muster up the courage to be able to get anybody to run. We'll see what happens. I'm not on the Matthew McConaughey train, I will tell you that. But we'll be watching that closely as well. Well, and thank you so much, Ange, from the great channel, What Do You Mean? It's good to see you in the chat. Thank you for the chat. Well, maybe we can jump into this, what I wanted to open up with, which is the title of this stream, which is Don't Be a Cynic. And I think it touches on a lot of problems that we're seeing on, the U.S. left right now. It's something that's like, it's a very easy thing to fall into. Not being cynical per se, but you sort of have a criticism of the way that things are. You have a criticism of the major institutions. And instead of participating in politics, we got some good chats here. I'll get to those in just one second. I'll come back around for all of them. So don't be cynical, right? What do I mean by that? You have a criticism of contemporary society, right? If you're an anti-capitalist, you certainly do, right? You recognize every day you work and you labor in a system that is not meant to benefit you. It's meant to benefit a few folks, and everything around you, from the media to politics to social spaces, are really designed to, deepen our opponent's power, right? And I see some people who, once you sort of go through your first kind of, I don't know, you start to realize that a lot of these struggles and a lot of these problems that you've been experiencing, in isolation are connected, right? I certainly had that experience as well. And specifically in politics, specifically in the United States, when you don't have a political party or political organization that you can really lean into, right? You're just watching people that you don't like on both sides bicker and fight. And it's really easy to sort of become cynical in the sense that you have a kind of prepackaged analysis of everything that's going on around you. And instead of being able to realize the moves and the shifts that are happening in society, it's just the kind of like, this all sucks. Maybe to highlight this, and the reason I was thinking about it was something I saw on Twitter, right? Which was, David Sirota. Let me pull this up. And please let me know if there's any issues. I'm using a new system here. So this is David Sirota, who said, readers eye roll and ignore stories about political corruption with tell us something we don't know, which then discourages media from covering corruption, which then encourages politicians to be even more corrupt because they know nobody cares. It's a really bad cycle. And we see Shahid, being the number one reply guy there. But Ryan Grimm, also doubled down on this. And he says, going to start blocking everybody who does this. Why are they following if they know everything already anyway? Ryan says, spends weeks reading through court documents, publishes evidence of collusion between Pfizer and Mylan CEOs. Reader, CEOs are corrupt, man. Could have told you that. Look, the folks are, sort of going through the motions, being a little frustrated with the public reaction to their work. But I see this all the time on the left. And look, I'm not trying to do this to be preachy. I actually really do think, and I sympathize with this perspective, right? Because I've fallen into it too, right? Where you're like, yeah, no shit, CEOs are evil and scoundrels and are trying to, put, as the slogan goes, put profits over people, right? But if you just live in that world, right, where you just sort of are reacting to everything with your preconceived notions instead of letting the analysis that you have, right, the structure and the philosophical foundation that you're standing on, be a bedrock for you and help you make better analysis, right? That's what you should be doing, right? Is letting your philosophical positions, your understanding, your readings of history, your readings and understandings of politics allow you to make good analysis of things that are happening around you. But more often than not, what I see is people sort of learning that politicians are corrupt, CEOs are corrupt. And that's it, right? And as David Sirota and Ryan Grimm are talking about, it's one of those things where, Ryan Grimm exposed this really horrific story about Mylan and EpiPens, right? A drug that is life-saving for folks, that they jacked up the prices. And he exposed horrible and clear-cut corruption. Not only that, but it has a direct connection to Joe Manchin. And, it's not that everybody ignored the story, but there's a certain segment of especially the left-wing community that's well, tell us something that we don't know, right? And again, it's one of those things where I wanted to sort of isolate it and point it out, and then to maybe sort of talk about where I think it comes from. So it's certainly a problem because, well, if you think that this is true, don't you want it to be exposed as much as possible so that people who don't already share your perspective on these things can deepen their understanding? And two, if you're a socialist, if you're somebody who's trying to build a different kind of politics, you need to be arming yourself with information as to why this system isn't working for the vast majority of people, right? I don't know. I'm from Austin, Texas, and I've probably talked about that a lot, but people talk about Austin as being a very, very liberal city. And there's a lot of like liberals here, don't get me wrong, a lot of like left-wing socially progressive folks. But the more you talk to people, I don't know if you ever watched like the movie Slacker, for example, which is like a great Austin movie. You know, a lot of the characters in there are like very, people might consider them to be political because they're talking about stuff all the time, right? They're talking about systems and the man and all that kind of thing. But it's extremely conspiratorial. Right? What I mean by that is it's like, yeah, the government's out to get you, or yeah, the big corporations, they're putting slop in your food, right? And look, they are, but it's one of those things where it's like, it's a political statement that's almost apolitical because it's so abstracted from from present reality, right? It's not, oh, the Mylan CEO has been exposed recently for fixing the prices of EpiPens, right? It's just, oh, pharma companies are bad, right? And again, if you were to have a conversation with somebody and like your one, victory was that you convinced them that pharma companies are bad, that's surely a positive. But what's more important is for people to understand how that's affecting them in their daily lives, who's responsible for it, right? And understanding, the webs, that yes, they go from the top down, but understanding who's in what position and who's doing what, right? Because it becomes really, really apolitical and really, really debilitating if your only kind of understanding of politics is that the system is rigged, the system is rigged and everybody's a liar and everybody's corrupt, right? It's like, yes, but like that's not getting you anywhere, right? And there was such a part of like, especially like 90s politics, that was like this kind of like, cynicism was like the religion of the day, right? Everything sucks, but there's nothing you can do about it, right? And there's that side of like cynicism that I'm seeing pop up more and more on our side, that can be really, really damaging. Because like, yeah, man, like the world really, really sucks. But just because you have recognized that doesn't mean we're any closer to solving the problems, right? And to have action on them, to do something about it, we need to really be understanding how these systems are interacting with each other, right? So the work that Ryan Grimm is doing there is really critical to that, right? It's like, yeah, is it surprising that a pharma CEO is doing bad shit? No. Is it important for us to know who is doing it and what they're doing? Absolutely. I'm going to get back to the chat in 1 second and start getting to some of y'all's questions and comments on this, and I'll come back to it in a minute too. But I just wanted to know one thing, like a crowd that's really, really bad with this. Look, and I'm including myself in it. It's taken a lot of time for me to break out of this. But when I first became a socialist, especially like a revolutionary socialist, somebody who's reading Lenin, right? I got really bad at this with this exact same problem, right? Because you stop paying attention to everything around you because you say to yourself, well, the only thing that matters is for us to have a revolution. Well, it's like, no shit. But if you look and you read Marx and you read Lenin, and you read all of these thinkers, did they just sit around and say that all the time? No, they were very, very involved in the scandals, at least aware and writing about them and interacting with them, with the scandals and the political movements of both their country, like their individual countries, and also of Europe as a whole, right? Because they understood that, to be able to act in the revolutionary moment, to be able to build a working class consciousness, you really have to be living in the world, right? Both in the sense of like you need to be able to communicate with people on a similar level, and two, you need to understand which way the classes are going, which way class conflict is moving, which way political conflict is moving in your society, which way ruling class, and I mean like capitalist conflict, which is something that is too often ignored by people on the left because they only focus on what's happening in politics, politics proper, in the sense of like, what's happening in the government, right? What's happening with major American corporations? Where are they butting heads? Where are their ruptures, right? You really have to be in the world. And the problem with a lot of the cynicism that you get is it can be really, really, nice to feel like, oh, I've got the answers and I've sort of got all figured out. The system's rigged, everybody's corrupt, etc., right? But what you really do when you take that step back and you can't even react to big allegations or scandals and things, like Ryan Grimm was exposing earlier this week, is you're taking yourself out of the world, right? You actually are becoming extremely apolitical when you're not when you're not able to be plugged in. Look, I get it. It's a long slog and it's a long fight, but like we can't fall into that trap, and it's much too prevalent and easy. And I think that I guess like for me, what really bothers me about it and why I get worried about it is like, again, I grew up, here, and I think I don't think it's a unique thing to Austin. I think it's all over the country, right? Because people are extremely alienated from politics, that they feel this way. Um, People are really alienated from politics. They're like, the conspiracies can be can be fun because, right, you're just viewing politics, right? And like, yeah, you might not be able to do anything about it, but like you've cracked the code. And I don't know. I know a lot of people, and I heard a lot of conversations growing up from folks who are really passionate about this stuff, right? They're poisoning your food, right? They're lying to you about the wars, right, etc. But it wasn't political at the end of the day, right? It was just sort of like, I'm not going to get plugged into the matrix kind of stuff. And I don't want us as a US left right now to fall back into that trap, because that's where a lot of counterculture stuff went, right? It never had a systemic criticism of capitalism, right? It never was truly rooted in analysis of material conditions for people, right? It was rooted in a kind of basic moral discourse about how like everybody is just like, the people at the top, they just don't have hearts, man, right? And we just can't fall into that trap. Well, let me see. I'm sure there's some stuff in the chat. I want to make sure that I'm not missing this. So Patrick wants to know, have you ever talked to anyone at length about centralizing left media? I mean, to some extent, I think that there might be some potential announcements of some people getting together and sort of trying to, connect different voices, on a similar platform. I think that could be helpful. I'm not against it. So if it works out, it works out. We'll see. I don't think that it's going to be a cure-all for a lot of these problems, unfortunately. I think, the real hope has to be that we start building up political and social organizations. But, getting a strong media movement together would be helpful. I think the difficulty right now is it's easier to do that with like a magazine, for example. But I think that there's people who are really working on that, and constantly these ideas have been tried, and hopefully one of them hits. I think it would be a nice thing if we could all sort of be operating in a similar world instead of just like a patchwork of a bunch of different, online cultures. Thank you so much, Christopher, for the super chat there. I know there's some of these questions in there. I'm going to come back to this. Patrick has a follow-up here. I'm just reading through these chats. Avery asks, we should talk with C. Derek Varn. I'd like to. I know Ben's had some conversations with some things with C. Derek Varn that I'd be happy to do. And I have not read the Murawski book. I apologize. Oh, speaking of books, though, I want to get back to these questions. And Patrick had a follow-up on the cynicism thing, so I want to get back to that. And I see there's some questions in Twitch. I'll get right to it. But I highly suggest this. I noticed that I didn't watch, but I noticed they had Adam Tooze on Majority Report today. Phenomenal book. I can't suggest it enough. I'm about halfway through right now. I just picked it up yesterday at my local bookstore. Adam Tooze is one of the most important people that you can be reading for economic history. His book Crash is phenomenal, and I think that his book Shutdown has been really, really helpful to me. Well, I'm going to come back to the questions in YouTube. Let me check Twitch. What happened in Brazil was a military corporate coup, like Romario Juca said, with the Supreme Court, with everything, everyone. If the motivation that you call labor exploitation doesn't exist for creating workplaces, isn't there way less of an incentive to create workplaces under socialism? No. So this is on Twitch for people who are on YouTube. Someone's asking, if the motivation that you call labor exploitation doesn't exist for creating workplaces, isn't there way less of an incentive to create workplaces under socialism, right? And I think that you're making a couple categorical mistakes there. One, by saying like the motivation for creating workplaces, right? Which is a funny way of phrasing it. uh, creating workplaces is to exploit labor, you're missing like the result for the motivation, right? The motivation is not to exploit labor just in and of itself. The motivation to exploit labor is to accumulate as much capital as possible, right? It's about profit at the end of the day. The labor exploitation is the mechanism by which by which capitalists make their money. Yeah. But the goal of capitalists is not just to exploit. It's much more. It's about pursuing profit. How would that operate in a system that is not profit oriented? Is a bigger question. So right, there's different models. For example, some people are very big on cooperatives, right? So still engaging on some kind of basic market exchange, but basically eradicating the bosses and the exploiters from the shop floor, right? So you're still working, but you are essentially owning your labor. You're voting on how much people are being paid, right? You're making those decisions for yourself and for your your coworkers. The other example of that I think is much more down the line, kind of Marxist understanding, is just the eradication of producing commodities for their exchange value, but rather for their use value. Every society since the beginning of history has had to figure out the answer to this question. How do we produce the things that we need and the things that we want? And how do we want to organize our community to produce that, right? Really early societies was a much more naked mechanisms for that, right? It was literally like, okay, well, we're low on food, so we need to send these guys out into the the forest or the plains, whatever, to go and hunt, right? We need this kind, we need people to go out and gather. We also need baskets and etc., right? And those things were made more often than not kind of collectively until they started to become more and more entrenched in society. And I'm not going to go through an entire history of like the division of labor, right? But like the point is that at a certain point in society it was very much governed directly in that way. Our societies are extremely complex, and capitalism has been a really effective system because the profit motivation has been able to organize a lot of different people in certain directions. The idea of socialism and then eventually communism is to transfer our system from a system that is doing this kind of mass organizing of labor and our social power, right, from just being driven by profit for profit's sake, and rather being met to meet human needs and human desires and human aspirations, right? And that is going to be a very, very difficult process because every part of the way that we produce right now is directed toward the profit motive. The idea is to slowly build up, or slowly or quickly, depending on your outlook, is to build up the conditions where this kind of fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is that there are people who produce and there are people who extract value from the producers, mainly the capitalists, that social class gets pushed down, right? So there is no like one-for-one roadmap for it, but rather understanding that there are class conditions that have developed to create capitalism, and trying to foster is essentially its antithesis, right? Which is worker power versus boss power, right? So the quick answer, people like co-ops. I take a longer, more historical view of this thing. So again, it's not just like a one-for-one. It's actually fundamentally reshaping all of these different aspects of our society. If there's no profit motive, I'll just keep on this question. If there's no profit motive, why will anyone create workplaces or compete, right? Well, in the same way that I just was saying very early, that human societies have constantly produced and worked for the goal of meeting needs, right? Profit is an abstraction of labor. Essentially, it's a way of quantifying some version of labor and using that as a means of exchange, right? So there's use value for goods and services, and there's exchange value, and those two things can be very, very different. Like the use value of a home is you have somebody living in it. The exchange value for a home is that you can sell that home on the on the market, right? And when those two things become out of whack, you have what are complete capitalist crisis, right? The housing crisis that we have right now in the United States is not a question of supply as much as it is a question of property values, right, over human needs, right? So that's the profit motive, right? And I think that you're making a categorical mistake when you select that the profit motive is the only possibility for a way to organize labor in society. You're 100% right that that is how we organize labor in contemporary society, but it doesn't have to work that way. There have been plenty of other versions of society and potentials that we're trying to build that aren't just motivated by profit for profit's sake, but rather for meeting needs. Because I have a lot of needs, as does everybody. We need food, we need shelter, we need all of these kinds of things that we can exchange our labor amongst one another. So I might be able to produce, hey, I cook really great barbecue, right? I can cook a lot of food for folks. In exchange for that, help me, create some kind of place for me to live, right? Blah blah blah, right? Like we can exchange our labor, and it's self-interested in the sense that, like, yeah, we need to work, we need to be working for one another. But the profit motive is just the way that we have organized labor in our society. It's not some kind of universal truth throughout history. All right, I think that's enough from there. Let's go over here, because I'm not gonna do that kind of conversation for the rest of the stream. David is opening up a barbecue joint. Let's do it. We should get David Harvey or Matt Christman on. I would love to have both of them on. I'd really like to have Matt. I've been really enjoying his his grill streams. All right, where were we? All right, the floods in Kowalski in the YouTube chat says the floods in Texas and the rest of the Gulf each year is a reason for infrastructure funding. How can we not get a couple Republican senators to take some pork home to fix it? Fake right-wing populism, to be honest. Well, I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, the fact that Ted Cruz is out here, during the storm last year, like flying off to Cancun, shows that their commitment even to their own constituencies, their own state, is very, very thin. I mean, I'm gonna tell you something though that I think a lot of leftists don't like to hear is, like, I don't think that it is people say, like, there's no possibility of like socialism is the only way out of the climate crisis. Like, I'm sorry, I can very much see an extremely unequal society in developing out of climate crisis, right? Where some of these things like building up that kind of infrastructure are built, but they're only built to protect certain communities, right? In the Houston area, I mean, one of the big things that people are pushing for is to build the Ike Dike, which is a great idea, and we're definitely going to need to be seeing a lot more of that. It will be interesting to see if we start to see any kind of green Republicans in the next few years. I think there might be a possibility of it, but again, they would want to do it in an extremely privatized way. They wouldn't want it to be public spending, and I think that would be very, very much disastrous. I mean, I still think the Green New Deal is the best kind of synthesis that we've developed so far to get out of here. Okay. Charles asks, is a socialist revolution necessarily violent? I mean, I think that all these things are going to depend on the conditions that you're in. I think that, so no, not in the sense that it's like anything is just universally true, universally one way. All right. From Twitch over here, we got, hey, David, Heaven Hill Whiskey workers with United Food and Commercial Workers Local 23D are on strike. Whiskey and strikes. That seems up your alley. Absolutely. I've been, trying to push the message up there. I'm sure I'll do a segment on it again tomorrow. But again, people should know Heaven Hill Whiskey, those workers are on strike, so don't cross. Continue to, if you're not buying it, don't buy it. And if you do buy it, maybe hold off a little bit until the strike's over. Jacob says, not sure if you saw this, but an Amazon warehouse in Alberta is going to have a union vote. No, I have not seen that. Please send that my way. I would love to see it. That sounds really, that's right up my alley too. I'd love to follow that. So David has something. I'm going to read these two questions in conjunction with one another, because we have Patrick Leslie said earlier, perhaps try to differentiate between about passive cynicism, what you're talking about, lazy pessimism, and active cynicism, which should motivate us to build more trustworthy micro structures. So keep that in mind. I'm also going to read David's question right here too. He says, I'm very cynical by nature, but I'm trying not to be. Also, a bit more skeptical of an effective pro-capital green policy seems to be many conflicting forces in capital for it, but maybe. Well, I think that you're on point there. I don't think that you're alone in realizing that it's like it's a big ask, and we are in a tough place right now. I think specifically the U.S. left right now is unmoored, and again, I still am of the belief that like the Bernie moment has to happen. It was an extremely beneficial moment, but it's created a lot of contradictions within the American left, right? Particularly that a lot of people got sort of radicalized very, very quickly, but they either got radicalized individually, right? What I mean by that is like spending time, by themselves, like reading and thinking and on the computer. And when it wasn't just purely individual, it was kind of ad hoc, right? Versus sort of being able to fall into a political structure that can help and do that really important political education that we really, really, really need. So I think it's 100%, correct, to be a little bit doubtful about our prospects. But again, I still think that being a socialist is a fundamentally optimistic position. But the cynicism, I think, having distrust of institutions is correct. But not being able to interact, like not being able to use that distrust in a productive way is a problem. Like, let me give you an example of this. I see this all the time on the U.S. left now, and like, obviously, look, I do independent media, right? So I'm in this boat as well. But Bernie Sanders loses in 2016, and he certainly does not get a fair shake in the media, right? And I think it's 100% important for working people in the left to be able to be building their own, media, specifically, news and journalism, right? There's a reason that the rich spend so much time and money trying to control those systems. I don't think that it's unimportant at all. But you talk to some folks, and I do get the impression that they think that like if we had like a leftist MSNBC, for example, in 2016, that it might be different, that the results might be different. I don't think that is true. I think that there were a lot of like fundamental structural problems to Bernie Sanders, not the least of them being the fact that the Democratic Party itself, its structure was designed to prevent not just a socialist from winning, but essentially a progressive, right? So you get, we have this like kind of like fixation and belief and trust in independent media. And I think, again, that's important, but also, independent media has its own problems, as like Matt and I have been sort of breaking down some of the kind of more kooky IDW folks. Right. So it's not just the sense that like, oh, okay, well, absent like corporate control, that this is necessarily going to be good. And you can see every kind of insane culture war thing that just gets, flared up on like left media is a great example of that. But beyond that, right, New York Times is, you read their editorial positions, they're horrendous, right? FT, sometimes it can be like straight up psycho stuff. Wall Street Journal is on a whole other planet. But I see this all the time where you have people who refuse to engage with these massive publications that have reporters on the ground all over the world doing real serious journalism, right? And they just discredit it and don't want to interact with it at all, right? instead of doing what we should all be doing is like, I spend a lot of time reading those publications. I get information from those publications. But I arm myself with the kind of knowledge to say, okay, well, this is something I might need to see if I can look into, right? Or this definitely seems like, I mean, we've done these things on the show before, right? Where you look at the way that like Evo Morales is written about in the New York Times, and it's scaremongering left and right. But you can just, if you train yourself to read these things, you can read right through a lot of the propaganda, because oftentimes there's not really much sourcing behind it. It's just things like, authoritarian tendencies. So it's like, well, what do they mean by that? Oh, they mean, confiscating, wealth from rich people or something like that, right? Like you have to arm yourself with the ability to be able to read those publications instead of doing what a lot of people on the left do, which is say, I'm not going to read mainstream newspapers because I've learned to not trust them. I think that that's a really, really dangerous position to start to take, right? Because you start to take yourself, one, out of the world, and two, you're getting all of your information secondhand, third hand, more often than not, from folks. And again, like building relationships and knowing which commentators and independent media sources that you can trust is important. But like, you do yourself a disservice when you just sort of say, I'm not going to read, the Financial Times. I get a lot of information from the Financial Times because they have some of the best reporters in the globe when it comes to covering the movements and the battles within capital, right? That's important as a socialist to be able to read and understand. Lenin's famous quote about The Economist, right? Again, another paper, absolutely psycho shit. I remember when Modi got elected, they were just like cheering, like, about the future of the globe, right? This is the greatest thing that's ever happened. We're finally going to break into, a more rational world with the victory of Modi. And what has he been in office? Just an absolute monster. And now, they've distanced themselves from him, right? But, the economists, there's plenty of journalists who do good journalism. And beyond that, it's important to be able to interact with them. As Lenin said, very famously, people should know this quote because it's a great one. It's like, what a gift we have here. We have the minutes of like the central committee of the international capitalist class. And, you can buy it at a newsstand. That's not verbatim what he said, but it's essentially that, right? Is that, you have this publication that is essentially saying what they're thinking and what they're saying to one another, and we can read it. That's good. That's a good thing to be able to do. I don't know. I just see it like, obviously like a lot of this, sometimes, you can get your brain broken from being on Twitter, like, you tweet out something and people are like, oh, fuck you, I'm never going to read a New York Times article. It's like, okay, I don't know what you're really getting at. And like, that's, I think, is like very far gone stuff. But I think, it's important to catch that within yourself. Like there were years and years where I never paid attention to like, congressional politics. And I still don't like spend most of my time reading and thinking about it because I do think a large amount of that is theater. But it got to a point, right, because I was like, oh, well, I'm a radical and all this kind of stuff. And, it's all bullshit what's going on in Congress, right? You do yourself a disservice because you're missing what's happening. And again, we need to be arming ourselves with as much information as possible. I'm coming back down the chat here. Eat Vegetables says, what's your idea of a good political education program for an org such as a DSA chapter? I think those are going to be defined mainly by your conditions, right, and where you are. Like, what are the big kind of questions of your community? But I think giving people a basic understanding of socialism and Marxism is really critical. I think that some of the best texts you can read by Marx, if that's like a good place to start, is Communist Manifesto, Critique of the Gotha Program, Civil War in France. And the 18th Brumaire, right? Those are all really accessible texts. You can read them in a reading group. They're like 45 to 50 minutes, maybe a little bit longer if you're a slower reader. I'm a slower reader. Nothing wrong with that. And those are things that you can sort of break down accessibly and talk about in your community. I think Leo Panish is somebody who's really worthwhile to listen to and to read, because he's somebody who is, at that moment of understanding, the tensions within social democracy, but also, the kind of failures of 20th century socialism as well, right? I think that he's somebody who is very worthwhile, right? What's the most important thing that you can be doing, though, is grounding people in concepts instead of just thinking that because people understand slogans with you, that they that we're all understanding things in the same way, right? tax the rich. Liberals say tax the rich, for example, all the time, right? I think we should be taxing the rich, but I think that's not the end all be all. Especially, and this is a big difference between left liberals and socialists and Marxists, right? Is that I don't just want to see a fair distribution of the profits of exploitation. I want to see the eradication of exploitation. So again, I support taxing the rich because it weakens their power in society, right? But I think it's not only that it goes further than that, it's like my attention is directed at a different part of the power structure than that. And that's the kind of political education that I think is really important to build on the left movement, right? Because I would sit out there if I was a politician right now and I'd say tax the rich, absolutely. But you could be bringing people in and not giving them the knowledge as to why we're doing what we're doing, and that weakens us down the line. Let me see. I'm coming back to all these questions. Patrick Leslie says, thanks for the chat. I do appreciate it. Says centralized socialist media, coal capitalist ideologues, elect national leadership, don't wait for them to apply, take a vote, and alert the nominees they've been elected. It will be on them to accept the popular will. I'm sorry, I don't understand the second bit as to what we mean by national leaders. You mean in a party? I'd be careful of that. 3, form a convention and draft a constitution, create the spine that all limbs can latch onto. Instead of debating ideology, we can debate constitutional tenets. Increasing unity, we need structure. Well, we certainly need structure. And I think I don't want to point people too much, to past work, but I did a long video just specifically dedicated to the party question. Maybe I could go back because we were doing a kind of section on that. And, we sort of broke away from it. Maybe I could go back to it, but if you're interested in this, I have a question, a video called "We Need a New Party, but What Kind?" And I sort of lay out the tensions that come with party building, because party building has happened many times. We can't, I think my tension right now is we won't be able to build the party until we have the people, and I think we can do ourselves a disservice by overestimating how rooted we are in the working class, right? I don't think that you necessarily need to start from saying this is the political party. But I do think that trying to continue doing the organizing work that groups like Socialist Alternative and DSA and PSL are doing is critical, and hopefully being able to merge as soon as possible all those forces. I'm a big fan of concepts, for example, like democratic centralism. By the way, where you have just vigorous debate within the organization and unity outside of it. That's one of the tensions that we have right now is we don't have that kind of external unity, and we don't really have a private place to be having these kind of fights. Let me see. We got some. I want to make sure that we're getting our friends over at Twitch in here too. Let me see. That Amazon Union Drive in Alberta is where I live. I wonder if this has anything to do with why they announced hiring 15,000 workers and increasing the starting wage to $21.65, $17.04 USD. Potentially, it's an interesting thing that Amazon does with wages is compare that. I don't know the conditions in Alberta, but compare that to warehouse work. At the nearby organizations. Amazon is interesting because they have a lot of turnover. And they have a lot of turnover because it's not unionized labor. But even in Bessemer, Alabama, Amazon, they were saying that we pay more than the average wage in the community. But if you looked at unionized warehouses in Bessemer, Alabama, the workforce actually was much higher paid at all of the other warehouses, right? And that's an interesting thing that Amazon does. They love to put out look how much more we're paying people, comparing them to minimum wage workers, when if you're comparing them to unionized workers, it's certainly not enough. And then they say workers say pay raise coincided with a loss of bonus pay, essentially. Ridiculous. Yeah, it's really I mean, Amazon is just absolutely is an egregious corporation, as we all know. Um, Appreciate the chat there. So Patrick says, call it a party or organization. It needs to be a leadership that is deferred to for most matters. We don't need a party. We need a new government. Hence, the Constitution, a Socialist Party will be null. Oh, so you're talking like down the line stuff. I mean, I think the problem right now is it's just like, what are you controlling, right? When it comes to an organization. There's been a lot of socialist organizations in the U.S. and brutal fights to become like essentially like demolishing democratic debate in those organizations, and then sort of selecting 10 people who are going to guide them to socialism. And 60 years later, we're still waiting for Godot there, and it didn't really happen. So organizational questions like that are almost secondary at this point to actually being able to get people into like one space and one way of thinking. And I don't have like the one shot answer as to how to build that. But I think some of the most important things that we can be doing on the left right now is building community as much as possible. I think that, the earlier suggestion of like trying to unify a lot of left media on some level would be beneficial towards that. I think that that's great. But I also think, even more important is going to be going out into your community and building those kind of structures that understand themselves as political structures, even if they might be directed at one very specific goal, right? And then we can start to build from those appendages, a united political organization. I mean, you have it on some level within the DSA, but DSA has the tension one between, dues paying members who are inactive, and the rest of the membership. And then you obviously have like the class questions and all those kind of things. And I'm not trying to get in the middle of DSA drama right now. But the fundamental goal has to be building and recruiting as much as possible and doing the kind of political education that's necessary. On political education, Billy Big Brick says, did you like Donda or did you love Donda? I'm sorry, I'm not the person to ask this question to. I don't really get it. I never really got Kanye. I hate to say it. Thoughts on Chris Stapleton? Chris Stapleton is great. I saw him very recently here in Austin. Down the line starts somewhere. You aren't controlling. You are showing unity and giving a standard to refer to. Yeah, I think so. I mean, but what I'm saying is like, how can we democratically elect leadership if we don't have the people? And I think that's sort of what the tension is. I think people fear reading The Economist will magically turn them into capitalists. People have to remember that it is not how it works. It would be like general reading Marx makes him based. Yeah. Here we go. Space Cowboy. I don't know if I'm saying that right. That says, appreciate the attention to chat. I'm very new here. Are you a member of a bigger organization or an individual journalist? No, it's just Matt Leck and I here at Left Reckoning. We used to be on TMBS. I used to do videos for Jacobin Magazine back before they had a weekly show. So I'm, I know all those folks and talk to those people, but it's Matt and I for the most part. Not that we're not interacting with a lot of other folks, but yeah, not a part of any other kind of journalistic organization. The open space is the net. It's Jimmy Dore's live feed. Community structures are null until we have virtually unified this giant group, and we do that through the appearance of legitimacy and consensus. Look, I think we're of the same mind on the importance of this. I don't know if we're coming across as having a disagreement. I appreciate the chance. I'm trying to figure out. I don't think that we have much disagreement as much as I'm saying. We have to be like actually building the community in a more tangible and permanent sense instead of the kind of ethereal sense that we have right now. Because the problem with a lot of left politics is it's like viewing politics, right? It's like this event happens in the media and it's like, how are you supposed to feel about it, right? And I think that like we need to be taking the steps further and thinking constructively as you are saying as well, right? We need to start building organization and structure, and I think starting to be able to tie into people's everyday lives, getting labor organizations to be larger parts of our movement, right? Being more class rooted is absolutely critical, right? And building those bridges is going to take rebuilding public space that has been taken from us, right? The churches have gone away, as community structures. Look, I'm not a Christian or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, the kind of community structures that used to were places where working class people were interacting with one another and talking with one another. They've been very much eradicated, right? So like, social halls, union halls have disappeared across the country. Music halls, for fuck's sake, dance halls, right? Those have become, have dwindled or become, essentially, extra expensive things that they're just not like a casual social thing for most working people. It's for, it's playgrounds for the wealthy and the kind of, upper middle class, right? We have to build those kind of community structures. So again, online, and people viewing political media absolutely are part of that. But I'm saying that, like, I don't think that we can just think of ourselves as a media movement if we want to be able to make the impact that is necessary. And I don't think that that's what you're saying either. But what I'm saying is that, like, we have to really be looking to building the structures, like, around us, like in your town, your community. And I think the places to do that are in organizations like DSA, are in organizations like Socialist Alternative, and even organizations like PSL, right? PSL, I see them everywhere, and I think that that's something that is really incredible, the amount of mobilization that they have. And I'll tell you, a lot of the people who they recruit and have as members of their organization really are class-rooted people, and I have the utmost respect for the organization. I very much disagree with a lot of their political lines, I will say. But I think that, like, those are some of the most vibrant places that we have right now, and all of those are in flux. And what I mean by that are, like, they're like, what their future is going to be is, like, not predetermined. It's very much being constructed around us right now. And, that's the kind of thing that we need to be harnessing. Church of Grill. Yeah. Yeah. Bill Bradley says, people discount the importance of things like community fairs and community cookouts and the importance of building a sense of unity within your community, I think. Absolutely. People should really check out the conversation that we had with Chuck Keeney. We released it on Sunday for patrons. I'm sure we'll release some bits of it in the future. But we talked about the Battle of Blair Mountain, right? Which was an incredible moment in American, like, labor history, where 3,000 people said, fuck this shit. We're going to go and we're going to fight for our rights. They took up arms. I mean, they made the ultimate move that you can when it comes to politics. And, they lose, but it's, an incredibly important moment in labor history, and it changed the game for sure, right? And they did those in conditions that weren't of their own choosing or making. They did those in conditions where they were living in company towns, man. Do you know that? Like, the people lived in houses that were essentially leased to them by their boss. So if you lose your job or you quit your job, you also lose your house. They were paid in fake money that could only be used at the boss's stores, right? Script. And then beyond that, they were isolated from other parts of society, right? In the sense that they were like mining towns. They were towns that were developed just around that main industry. So those weren't conditions of their own choosing in the same way that our conditions aren't of our own choosing either. And still they were able to break through that and build their own kind of community structures that were then utilized as forums to be able to convince people to stand up and unionize and fight back, right? And that's the kind of thing that we need to be able to think creatively about. There is no roadmap. And I think that's one thing that's really, really hard for some people to wrap their heads around, that there is no amount of theorizing or, reading Marx or Lenin or anybody like that is going to say, like, here are the 10 things that you need to do. What those things will equip you with is a way to analyze what's going on around you so that we can come up and think of strategies for us to be able to build those kind of political organizations that are going to be necessary for us to win. I think that the key takeaways that we have right now is we have to revitalize American labor, not only revitalize it, but make it more militant. And we also need to be building social and political organizations where we can be having these kind of debates and doing this political education that is necessary. Thanks for the AV chat there. I do appreciate it. Making sure I don't look like an idiot. There's not much I can do about it, though, unfortunately. 16 tons, what do you get? Exactly. I'm reading through the questions. Let me see, y'all. Yeah, I'm taking questions from the chat, especially Twitch. I know there's like a big debate going on YouTube, so I'm trying to make sure that I'm not missing anybody here. I think, and I said this too, like right after Bernie loses, that some of the most important lessons that you can get in the U.S. for like what a working class movement will look like and some of the pitfalls that will come with it will be revisiting and understanding the American populist movement, right? Because it's a kind of proto-socialist movement. And what I mean by that is like these weren't informed primarily by like socialist criticisms of capitalism at large, but rather, monopoly and financial power, right? And the American populist movements are very, very inspiring. And do show a kind of American militancy that I think is oftentimes ignored. I mean, like, the thing is, like, if you're sitting here and you're listening to this and you're in the South or you're in the Midwest, right, or, even out West to some extent, like, you are living in parts of the country that were the hotbeds of radicalism. Hell, even here in Texas, right, and, FDR and the New Deal were not the end-all be-all of, like, working class militancy. But don't forget that, like, FDR's, like, boys to push through a lot of the more radical proposals of the New Deal, those committees were chaired by Texans, right? And there was a kind of a different deal in politics that we had that has been completely rewritten, where people think, oh, you live in a red state, like your history is just like being anti-union, anti-worker, and as horrifyingly racist and anti-indigenous as possible, right? And certainly the ruling class of those societies, that is true, but not working people as much, right? And being able to recognize and take hold of that history and build off of it is really, really critical. And anyways, going back to those moments in American history where you did see this kind of more militant working class politics starting to develop, seeing how it happened. Populist movement is a really great example of what I mean by like community structures. They were going to the churches, they were going to the dance halls, right? Where people were, and somebody would come in and they would start talking about why you're being screwed over by finance at this moment, right? Why you're being, screwed over by the gold dollar. And that developed a political movement that ended up fundamentally shifting and reshaping American politics. It wasn't successful in the way that we would like it to have been, right? And also wasn't as clear-cut of a socialist message as we would like it to be. But you did see working class organizations that had already existed just out of kind of like natural community and culture being utilized in a radical way. And I think that what we need to be doing is searching for that. So I think finding ways to use internet spaces to do that, it can be really, really beneficial. But I also think it can be easy to sort of distract yourself in internet communities and thinking that you're doing the work, as we can see from a lot of kind of like cosplay, anime Maoists on there. I'll debate Sam Cedar. I'm not afraid. Um, I mean, the anti-vax stuff, I think that there is some truth to the sense that, like, that's a reaction to a medical system that has failed a lot of working people. It's a reaction to, and as we were talking about being cynical, a kind of realization that, like, yeah, the system is rigged, um, but not having that next step conversation to understand why it is and how it is and for whom it is. Um, uh, right? And that's just what happens when we're all alienated, because we are all alienated. That's like the fundamental condition of capitalism is alienation. Um, so I think, when you see these kind of irrational movements, I mean, they're sad in the sense that they're hurting people, and they're also sad because, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really nasty folks out there who are really capable of pulling a lot of people, alienated people, and giving them answers to these questions. I mean, you get that with New Age stuff too. I did a whole video for Jacobin, almost a year ago now. Damn. Um, about the self-help industry. I mean, that shit is all about convincing people who are feeling alienated from their own lives that actually the problem is not the bosses, but that you don't have like the right perspective on your work and your boss, right? Um, that shit's really nasty, and like the solution might be to show up and work harder. Yeah. All right, y'all. I think I'm gonna head out. Tomorrow we will be coming live to y'all at 7 Central. Me and Matt Leck. We're gonna be talking about Palestine, making sure that we don't take our eyes off of the ball there. We are going to be talking about Entergy in Louisiana, and also taking another look at this move to really try to radicalize the union movement in Texas, in a radical and new direction. I'm looking forward to that. And I believe this Sunday for patrons are going to be having another deep dive into Brazil with Victor Puggi. I will give y'all more info on that soon. But until then, see y'all tomorrow.